Hi and welcome. My name is Sandy Jacobson. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation with two of the four candidates for the Santa Monica Rent Control Board. This program is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica Education Fund in partnership with CityTV of Santa Monica. Neither the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica Education Fund nor the CityTV of Santa Monica support or oppose any candidate for public office or any political party. You will be hearing from two of the four candidates who are running for two open seats on the Santa Monica Rent Control Board. All candidates were invited to participate. The individuals you elect will serve four-year terms of office beginning in December 2016. The format for this program is similar to a talk show format. I will ask a series of questions which the two candidates will in turn answer. So what is the Rent Control Board and why do we have one? Let's start by saying Santa Monica is a charter city. The California Constitution gives cities the power to become charter cities. In other words, a charter city's law concerning a municipal affair will prevail over a state law governing the same topic. The Rent Control Board became an integral part of the government of the City of Santa Monica, but exercises its powers and duties independent of and without interference from the City Council, City Manager, and City Attorney. What does a renter need to know about the Rent Control Board? A resident may contact the Rent Control Board for help if there's a rent dispute or question, if there's untreated deferred work that impairs health or safety, if there's a loss of amenities that were originally included in the rental agreement, or if there's harassment. So let's meet our candidates. Carolyn Torosis, I'm so sorry, Carolyn Torosis, and Anastasia Foster. Carolyn Torosis, I'll say your name right, and let's start with you. This is simple. Who are you, and why are you running for the Rent Control Board?
Great. Well, thank you, Sandy, for the introduction, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to be here tonight. My name is Carolyn Torosis, and I'm a consumer protection attorney. This election is really personal for me. My entire life, I've fought for those who otherwise wouldn't have a voice to be able to be heard, whether it was workers who weren't being paid all of the wages that they were owed, individuals facing foreclosure from their homes, or in this case, landlords and tenants who really just wanted someone to hear them and someone to be able to talk them through their options. As the director of the county's dispute resolution program, I mediated hundreds of landlord-tenant cases in court on a daily basis, and I dealt with those who were having policy issues regarding their tenancy. I think that I lend a unique policy perspective, a unique legal perspective. I know what it means when tenants are telling me that they're victims of harassment, that they're not having habitable premises. I also know what it means that when there are landlords who are saying they're honest and they're just trying to make a living, struggling to make ends meet. And I think that the Rent Control Board really provides a forum for everyone to be heard and for the law to be enforced fairly. And so I feel very passionately about doing that on the Rent Control Board. I love Santa Monica. I think that renters, they make up over 70% of our city. They're an integral part to the city that we live in, and I think it's really important that we have a representative Rent Control Board. Thank you.
Thank you. Anastasia.
Hi, well, thank you, Sandy, and thank you to CityTV for and League of Women Voters for having this forum. I'm a 10-year renter of Santa Monica, and I think I bring a unique perspective to the board in that I'm an appointed incumbent who's been serving for about 10 months now, and I'm running for re-election. I started out just a regular citizen like anyone else, and about 5 years ago got involved in some things happening in my own building and ended up helping a neighbor. I ended up consulting the Rent Control Board and getting information. I had no idea all the different concepts and tenets of rent control. Then I started working with Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights. I volunteered on their tenant helpline, fielding dozens and dozens and dozens of calls from renters and some landlords who had questions about procedures and policies, and some were in crisis at the moment, and that was a real eye-opener. I think what really has informed my decision from the beginning, though, to participate in this is my work with Meals on Wheels here in Santa Monica. I've been driving for over 5 years, and I have 100 friends most of whom are either elderly or disabled and mostly homebound. And most of them are renters, or a good number of them are renters. And I just heard over and over and over again about their fears, their concerns, and that really got me interested. And I must say that working on the hotline gives you a thorough education. And in the 10 months I've served already, I've just really enjoyed this work so very much.
So you're already on the board, as you say. What is your most important responsibility as a member of the Rent Control Board?
I wouldn't say there's any just one most important. I think what people should know about the board is that we're a quasi-judicial body in that our rulings carry the weight of law. The next stop after us is the court system. So when a hearing officer makes a decision on a dispute between a landlord and a tenant, if it's to be appealed, it comes to us. And there's 5 of us, and we deliberate openly and publicly. The staff report is made public where everyone can see what's at stake and what happened during the hearing process. So that's a wonderful and an important part of our job. But we also affect policy. So we can propose changes. It's like you are educating everyone to the charter system, and the rent control charter is an independent law. And we can propose and make changes right there from the dais for the rent control law as things ebb and flow and times change and situations change within the city. And we also can advocate. The charter states that our job is to preserve rent-controlled housing, preserve. So we go to Sacramento, we advocate, we participate with other districts and other jurisdictions to be constantly learning. And I think it's a 3-pronged job you have when you serve on the board.
And I also would add, Anastasia's done a phenomenal job, and the board really has an active policy-making role. I think it's really important. The Rent Control Board also serves as really a beacon of information for the community, because anyone who's subject to rent control can ask the board, and even if you're not subject to rent control, the board publishes information for the public, for landlords and tenants, really outreaches to the public to let them know of their rights and responsibilities, and also is a place where someone can go if they have a question or if they just need help talking through their options. So I think that that's really important as well, that whether or not you are under rent control, you can seek the advice of the Rent Control Board as to how to proceed. I think that that's really important. And I think that being able to work effectively with City Council and with other departments within the city is important for the board as well.
There's a question that I've been asking of the different candidates who've been running for City Council and the school board. It's come up a lot this year in Santa Monica. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Santa Monica we have a representative form of government. Mm-hmm. And whether it's the City Council or the Board of Education, of course, the Rent Control Board. So here's a scenario. As a member of the Rent Control Board, you hear from the public on a variety of contentious issues. You listen to the public, you study the issues, and you vote in the way you believe is best for the renters and the community. Mm-hmm. And yet, at the next meeting, a renter comes up to you and accuses you of selling out and not listening to the needs of Santa Monica renters. How do you respond? Carolyn, lead us up.
Great. I think that's a very valid and important question, especially in these times. People are always quick to look to see, what decision did you make that I don't agree with? And I think that in my day job, I have a lot of experience with dealing with constituents because that's what I do. I serve the public. I work for Los Angeles County, and oftentimes people will come to our public counter very upset, very angry. I also serve appointed commissioners from the Board of Supervisors, and I think that you are always going to have people who don't see eye to eye with you. But I think it's really important to communicate openly, to be transparent. No one said that everyone has to agree all the time, but if you're very transparent in your decision making, if you let everyone know, your thought process, if you are careful to take the time to meet with the constituents and hear from your stakeholders and hear from those who are concerned, all you can do is let that individual know, the reasons why you made the decision that you made and the steps that you took in making that decision. And I think that although he or she might not agree with you, I think that they will respect you much more if you take that time to openly communicate with them and they really feel like they've had a voice and they've been heard by you. And I think that you would deal with that person respectfully, just like you would deal with any other constituent of the city. I really pride myself in being open and being responsive to the community, and I think that I would take those same values if elected to the Rent Control Board.
Anastasia?
I echo a lot of almost everything Carolyn said, for sure. being open, honest, transparent, being willing to meet with constituents. I've done it. Carolyn's even done it. We've all done it. I think a lot of us have. And you can't please everyone all the time. But what I love to tell people when they come up, and they'll come right up to the dais at the end and say, why did you, the law, and being a responsible commissioner means that you follow the law. So the law protects landlords and renters equally. And there are provisions in there for both, designed to protect both and the interests of both. And if you can clearly point to the law and say, look, I felt obligated to uphold the law and to vote in this way, that's what you tell them. You tell them exactly what happened and maybe what could be done to change things in the future. But that's another big thing. I love making policy. And that's the beauty of local politics and local laws. They can be changed. They can be adapted. They can move with the times. And if something's not working, then you can work to change that. You can have input from the community. You can put an item on the agenda, and you can try to persuade your fellow board members to see that maybe something needs to be changed or updated. And that's another great
So
piece
there are
of work.
4 of you on the board,
5.
5 commissioners? Okay, of course, because otherwise you'd end up like the Supreme Court.
Tied.
A major goal of rent control when it was adopted in the late 1970s was to preserve the affordable housing stock in the city. Yet each year we lose 400 to 500 units as they are removed from the rental housing stock, and there's no viable way to replenish. This is beginning to add up. Outside of repealing the Ellis Act, do you see any solution to this program? To this problem? And let me say that the Ellis Act, just for those of us who aren't up to date, up to speed, is a California state law that allows landlords to go out of the rental business. In other words, to close up their apartment building and therefore take off any number of units off of the market. So, Anastasia, what do you see any solution to how we're going to replenish the stock of housing units?
So any building built after 1979 does not have to be under rent control. It's voluntary, and I don't think very many have ever volunteered. Preserving the stock, like I said, is part of the charter mandate. The whole board has to focus on trying to preserve. And Costa-Hawkins is another act you didn't mention that's at the state level, which allows vacancy decontrol.
Right. So
if someone moves out of a unit at $1,500, the next person who moves in, the landlord may charge whatever the market will bear. It could be $3,000. And so we have 67% of our current rent-controlled housing is at or above market. That's according to our latest annual report from 2015. So there are 2 ways to think of preserving that housing stock. We have our long-term renters, which you may consider from the 1970s, but we also have kind of a new crop of long-term renters, which are those that have been in place since the mid to late 90s when that Costa-Hawkins law went into effect. And then you have the newer renters who are at the tip-top market rates of the last couple of years.
They were affected by vacancy decontrol.
That's right. That's right. So and then the hotness or coldness of the local market, because we've had vacancy decontrol since 1999, and it hasn't always been this much of a fluctuation. We had 10% growth in rents just in 1 year alone between 2014 and 2015, and we now top Los Angeles County in new rents because of vacancy decontrol. So what is the solution? You run into a little problem with private property rights and the rights that the landlords have been given with Costa-Hawkins and with Ellis. What we can do is continue to protect. Measure RR in 2010, voted in by the Santa Monica voters, extends rent protections for evictions even to non-rent controlled tenant housing, for instance, giving them longer time to make repairs or to make good on something that they're not doing correctly, rather than being evicted right away. We're trying to keep people, if they want to be, in their homes longer to provide that stabilization of those prices longer. New affordable housing, newer ways of finding affordable housing would be one solution, but it's a really tough question.
Right, and I agree. I mean, it is a tough question, and certainly since Costa-Hawkins has gone into effect, rents in Santa Monica have increased at a faster rate, and that's the reality of the situation. In terms of adding to our rent-controlled housing stock. I know that something that's been explored in the past has been adding rent-controlled units into development agreements, so that when any new development property is built and then goes onto the market, there are a certain number of units in that property that are rent-controlled. Not sure as to the political viability of that at this point, but it is something that's been done in other jurisdictions. I also think that the Rent Control Board did a really great job. They called City Council to ask for an Ellis study to look at the incentives behind why people are Ellising their buildings. What areas are the buildings being Ellised in, under what zoning?
What usually happens when someone declares themselves under the Ellis Act? Are they going to tear down the building? Are they going to turn it into condos?
I think that that's part of what is going to hopefully come through with the Ellis study, but most of the time it's because the landlord is going out of the business and they're doing any number of things. So I think that it's really my priority to preserve the rent-controlled housing stock in Santa Monica, to de-incentivize these Ellis activities by potentially upzoning or downzoning in specific areas of the city that might de-incentivize this. I can't really speak to exactly what the person does with the building, because I don't think we've seen the results of the Ellis study yet, and that is forthcoming, and I'm definitely looking forward to that.
I would only add that when you were asking what might they be doing with the property, if they rehabilitate the property and don't tear it down and leave it as individual apartment units, if they return the building to active rental within 5 years, it comes back under rent control, and it has to be offered to the people who were vacated.
Right. The original tenants.
Yes, and that has happened. That has happened in several cases.
Now, when they bring the tenant back in, and as you say, it's happened, so this is not a hypothetical, does that tenant go back in under the rent that they had before the remodeling or rehabilitation?
Right. It depends on how long it's been. So if it's been
complicated.
If it's been 2 years, I believe you have the first right of refusal at your rent-controlled price, and if it's been up to 5 years, you just have the first right of refusal at market rate
to take the unit.
And the other thing is that it should be noted that there are about 27,500 units under rent control in the city. About 9,000 of those have been removed since Ellis. Only about 2,000 to 2,500 have been actually as a result of Ellis. There are other reasons why units are being removed from the rental market, whether a lot are due to owner occupancy exemptions or other use permits.
So an owner can occupy his own property?
In a property with three or fewer units.
3 or fewer.
That was a compromise during the formation of rent control.
Right, so I think that this is the totality of circumstances that has to be taken into account when looking at what is incentivizing these units to be removed from our rent-controlled housing stock, not necessarily just the Ellis activity. How do we bring them back on the rental market, and then also how do we increase or maintain the supply of rent-controlled housing?
So you brought up, it had a name, but the effect is vacancy decontrol. Okay, so that changed things around. Santa Monica didn't originally have vacancy decontrol. Explain what that is. That you actually mentioned it, but the cost for a first-time renter entering the Santa Monica market is now nearly unaffordable.
It was an act brought forth by some state legislators in 1995, and because of legal troubles and wrangling, it took 4 years before it actually went into place in Santa Monica. So since 1999, anyone who voluntarily or vacates or is evicted from an apartment, the next renter in that unit, the landlord can charge whatever the market will bear. And then it gets recontrolled at that number and is subject to the general adjustment going forward. Some of the huge impacts that has had, like I said, 67% of our current 27,000 plus units are at or near or above market. So landlords are enjoying a return such as they've hardly ever known before. It's also encouraged a lot of speculation in the real estate market. So buildings are turning over at an alarming rate.
You mean new owners?
New owners to the same older buildings.
Landlords.
And they're inheriting rent-controlled units with tenants in place. So there's a lot, we could talk for an hour just about this alone. Costa-Hawkins is probably one of the most impactful things to affect our housing stock in our history. With buyouts, someone can legally be offered any amount of money to simply vacate their apartment voluntarily. It does follow a procedure. It has to be filed with the board office and with the city attorney's office, but that's possible.
You mean a landlord can say to a tenant, if you leave, I will give you $10,000?
Much more.
More than that.
Really?
And
Like
much
what?
more. 30, 50.
Wow.
So, and the other thing I think that I wanted to add is that with vacancy decontrol, it's probably obvious, but before vacancy decontrol, the unit would be re-rented at a predetermined amount, not necessarily at what the market would bear. And since you have had these rental income skyrocketing, I think that this is really incentivized tenant harassment, because what will happen is these landlords will want tenants who have stayed in for a long period of time to leave so that they can then re-rent the unit at a higher value. And I'm not saying that all the landlords are doing this. Of course, you just have a few bad actors, and I think that it's really important that with the landlord-tenant relationship and with the balance of power maybe in favor of the landlord, and with the resources, it's really important that we're able to educate tenants and let them know their protections against this type of behavior, because for me it's really important. I've seen tenant harassment firsthand, and we need to make sure that we guard against that, especially as our market continues to improve.
But part of my question was about not so much people who are already here in place, but the new people coming in who would like to come in, but it's unaffordable.
Right.
Is there? Let me just backtrack a second. When you say that rent control does not affect any building built after 1979, so is the stock you're dealing with all pre-1979?
Yes, almost exclusively.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and people are not building new properties to come on the market?
They certainly are building new properties that come on the market. We have approximately 11,000 units of apartments that are not under rent control in Santa Monica, and all of those were built, either have been removed other ways, like the owner occupancy. Torca, for instance, a really interesting program in the 90s, 80s and 90s, had sort of the unintended consequence of taking, by the time it's finished, by the time the Torca buildings who applied have finished their procedures, almost 3,300 units of rent-controlled apartments will have gone off the market forever as condominiums now. But the unintended consequence I mentioned was that it's very complicated, but as best they can tell, less than 500 of those went to renters that bought their unit.
And just to answer your question, I think it's also important to note that rent control does, I know you're saying it's not very affordable, and yes, to afford anything larger than a one-bedroom apartment in Santa Monica, you have to make an average of over $100,000 a year, and we've all heard those statistics. But let's say you have young professionals coming into the city who really want to invest in the city. Rent control still affords that level of stability in knowing what you can plan for going forward, and so I really think it's important that we take that into account. I mean, I want all of my friends to be able to grow and thrive here and feel like they can contribute to this community as stable, long-term renters.
And the newer buildings downtown are relatively expensive as well.
Okay. So what you're saying is, in effect, that somebody comes in, the rent's high, but they know that it's not going to escalate from that point on. So even with the best protection of the rent control laws for our longtime tenants, and you were referring to them before, the people who who are serviced by Meals on Wheels, they're aging in place on a fixed income. And what they're getting from Social Security may be the lion's share of that income.
Right.
And so now they're paying like 60 to 80% of their income in rent. And that's tough. So that leaves little extra for food or healthcare or transportation or something. How should the Rent Control Board and the city respond to this? You're nodding.
Well, we are responding. Currently, there's a wonderful plan. It's a pilot program. I've also worked with the Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights Housing Committee, and we helped inform the decision, along with some other groups in the community, to form a pilot program for rental assistance to people who can prove their rent burden status being just so egregious that they would have trouble aging in place or staying in place with a young family or any other circumstance. So if they income qualify and can show that the percentage of their rent is rent burdening them, they can qualify for the pilot program. Now, measures GS and GSH would also earmark some of that money to expanding the program to a much larger amount of money to help people who are rent burdened stay in place.
Right. Carolyn, what's your understanding of this program? How does this operate?
Right. So Anastasia mentioned it absolutely perfectly. We have a pilot program for rental subsidies. My understanding is that these measures, if passed, GS and GSH would expand the subsidies for people who meet the certain criteria. You alluded to affordable housing before. I think that it's been very difficult with the dissolution of redevelopment to build more affordable housing in Santa Monica, and we are woefully under our targets for what we need to be at to provide an acceptable level of affordable housing here. I think that these rental subsidies provide, an additional method to potentially have people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to live here that luxury. I think that especially with seniors and the disabled population, it's really important that we are looking out for those groups.
Is this in place now?
It's actually happening as we speak. So I think the first round of participants are being selected in this moment.
Just out of curiosity, what is the criteria?
So there's an application that they sent out, and anyone in the city was welcome and invited to fill it out to see if they qualified. And I took a look at it myself. It was inside the rent control bulletin that was put out last quarter. So I don't remember the exact details, but you had to prove income with tax returns. And you had to prove, and we know what everyone's MAR is, maximum allowable rent, because it's in a public database. So it's not difficult to check what they're paying in rent against their income.
Who gets the rent control bulletin?
Every single rent. So when I moved into my apartment, my first apartment, about 9.5 years ago, on 18th Street, the landlord's responsibility, according to the charter, is to register my new tenancy. So it doesn't have a name attached to it, but it has the fact that address with that letter
and that unit
was rented.
Anyone under rent control would
and then
get
that generates the rent board to send you the notices from them
in the mail.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that both of us are very passionate about outreach, and I think looking at ways we can outreach to more people would definitely be.
I just had an item the other night I'd love to tell you about.
Yeah, appreciated.
How long will it take for you to tell us about it?
So the other night I agendized a request of staff to look at the legality of requiring landlords to present a tenant rights and responsibilities. Let's call it a fact sheet or a greatest hits, of everything.
FAQ.
The tenant harassment ordinance, the rent control law, and Measure RR protections. As things change, if you rented an apartment 30 years ago, you might not realize that when you turned 62, new things applied to you, new rules applied to you, new interpretations of the rules applied to you, new buyouts applied to you if your building is up. So many things can change, whether you're new or have been a longer term renter, and some of the landlords don't know exactly how things come and go and change. And while the board does an amazing job of making the information available, that still doesn't mean that everyone finds it and gets to it. So really quickly, I just wanted to say that when I rented my apartment, I moved here from Chicago, and I did not ever live in a rent-controlled community in my life. And when I moved here, I looked at dozens of apartments, and no one mentioned the words rent control. I signed my first lease without knowing that I would be subject to property tax pass-throughs based on the number of units in my building. I didn't know what the general adjustment was or how or when it would be applied. I didn't know about eviction protections. I didn't know how to approach maintenance issues. I knew none of that. And this sheet would go a long way towards showing them on the date of lease signing for new people, and mail the same thing to everyone. Everyone needs the information.
Okay.
And the board does 5 mailings a year, so it could inexpensively be coupled with one of those mailings.
So now I'm going to talk about Milton Friedman, the economist from the University of Chicago, the late economist. And he was against price controls of any kind, particularly rent control. And I'm going to read a quote because I want to get it right. He said that, quote, rent control along with laws protecting tenants against evictions involves partial expropriation of property rights. It limits the owner's right to use and to profit from the use of his or her property. It also restricts the opportunity of everyone else who would like to bid for the use of the properties thus controlled by the government, end quote. What are your thoughts on what Milton Friedman said? Carolyn?
Well, like you mentioned at the outset, Santa Monica is a charter city, and we did pass the rent control in this city, and it's something that was approved by the electorate, and I think that it's something that we've had here that's so vital and important to the fabric of this community. I hear what he's saying from an economic standpoint, but from a social standpoint, I think that we need rent control to be able to preserve the diversity, the stability, and the integrity of this community. Like I mentioned earlier, it's shown that since vacancy decontrol, rental prices have skyrocketed, and that is because the market will bear a very high rental price. However, what do you do about people who have contributed to this community, who have been here for 30 years, who have invested in our schools, and their children have grown up here? I think it's really important because it provides that sense of stability, it provides people the ability to age in place, and it provides a sense of home, and you have less transiency and more investment in this community. I think it's really important that we have these renters, and that we give these protections to renters to be able to feel like they are afforded some of the benefits of home ownership, such as being able to prepare for these fixed costs into the future. And I strongly support rent control and what we have here in Santa Monica. So I understand what he's saying, but I would disagree on the rent control side. I think that from a social perspective, it's really important for Santa Monica.
And maybe add that there is no such thing on this planet as pure capitalism. Democracies dictate that the citizens get together in a city or a town or a state or a country, and they decide what interpretation of that foundation and that base that we started from, where we go from there. And we have individual choice in a charter city, and the voters, spoke, and they've had ample opportunity to take it away if they wanted, and they've always kept it. Also, I think with vacancy decontrol and almost 70% of the units being at or near market, I think we're benefiting everyone. And there's one thing I'd like to add. It's not the color of the shutters or the style of the landscaping bush someone chose to plant in front of their building that has taken a one-bedroom from $1,000 to $2,300 a month in just a few short years. It's the value of the schools, like Carolyn said. It's the value of our marketplace and all of the things that the city has spent money on and that the citizens have contributed through committees and organizations and neighborhood associations and chambers of commerce and everything that have built that value that they're now enjoying. And I think the stability that rent control brings even to our owners is something that has a little more value than I think some people might think.
Okay, I have another one. There was a recent article in Fox and Hounds, and again, a man who is a specialist in, what does he call himself, a consultancy specializing in housing issues. Okay. He writes, in communities where rent control is practiced, the results are predictable. Less housing as investors see no economic benefit to building. Scams as beneficiaries exploit excessive demand, and deteriorating conditions as rules prohibit pass-throughs and thereby discourage capital improvements and regular maintenance. The article even mentions Santa Monica and, you probably guessed, Berkeley, as seeing declines in their rental population, with Hispanics being disproportionately impacted. Is that a fair description of the state of rent control in Santa Monica? If it is, what, if anything, can you, as an elected member of the Rent Control Board, do about it?
Well,
Anastasia?
I'd like to start out by saying that you're right about the Hispanics. That is an alarming trend, and as vacancy decontrol creates more and more expensive unit prices, we have seen in our numbers that number is starting to go down in Santa Monica, and that's alarming to me. But those first three tenants that you talked about, two of those don't even apply here because of vacancy decontrol. So as a matter of fact, I just left a building this afternoon that turned over that I believe was initially under $1 million and just sold for $3.2 million. And it's fully occupied. They hope to turn those tenants over perhaps, and their own advertisement for the building said maybe we can get 80% upside. people are buying these buildings like hotcakes. So I would absolutely disagree with that statement that it causes people not to want to. And the equity in a home that an existing owner could borrow against is skyrocketing. It's almost non-ending. Is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, and I think that when you said owners aren't allowed to pass through the tenants, that's simply not entirely correct in Santa Monica. In fact, for our bond measures, for example, 100% of that can be passed through to the tenants. And I think that with vacancy decontrol, and I know that we keep mentioning it, the whole purpose of vacancy decontrol is that the landlord can rent the unit at whatever the market will bear. And that purpose is the landlord can rent their units to make a profit.
To build in their costs.
Right. They build in their costs. They still can pass through to the tenants, and theoretically could be making a profit off of that rental income. So I think that I would disagree with that statement, but it has been something that's been talked about as, habitability issues and what's the incentive for these landlords to fix up the units if you have these tenants under rent control. A majority of rent-controlled units are now at market rate, as we know, after Costa-Hawkins. But additionally, I would be interested in exploring potential subsidies for landlords to make these needed improvements for units that are still with long-term tenants if they feel that it's not economically feasible for them to make those improvements.
But they also are, in conjunction with a program like that for landlords maybe who feel, there's a petition in place at the board that any landlord who feels they are not making a fair return can apply for rent increases. And I checked with the board, 1 to 2 have been issued in the last time anybody can remember, and she's been there for over 20 years.
Right. So in other words, the landlord could ask for more money, but it
if
rarely
they can prove
happens.
they're not making a fair return.
Let's say that the
under law.
landlord adds an amenity to the building, or they're making it more desirable for a tenant to live there, and they want to petition for a rent increase for their tenants. They're entitled to do that.
Is when you talk about a pass-through, is a pass-through, you mentioned taxes or bonds. What about painting the building or planting new flowers? What counts as an improvement?
That's a different category. So capital improvements are a different category, and at this time, I don't believe they're not passing that through. So what happens because of vacancy decontrol? We do have a huge process in place right now for construction decrease petitions. So when a new
Wait.
Well, it's
Help
the same.
me through that one.
So if an existing owner wants to improve the building, or wants to improve units within the building, or wants to improve common spaces, maybe landscaping, maybe a water, some feature or something, they can do it. But when a unit becomes vacant, that's the time they usually do it. So they'll go in and put in granite countertops, put in ceiling fans
to that one
to that one unit.
But what about keeping the outside, of course, safe, but...
That's been a complaint in the past, and perhaps before 1999 there was a lot more meat to that argument of not wanting to fix up the buildings or not justifying it by the profit margins. But with vacancy decontrol and 70% almost being at market rates, that means if they want to charge $3,000 for a one-bedroom, they're going to fix up the common spaces and the entryway in order to do that. And as a matter of fact, the point I was trying to make, and I didn't come at it quite clearly, was that construction decrease petitions for the other tenants who are staying in place and not getting a new countertop, but living through the construction of the improvement of the common space or living through the construction of the gut rehabilitation of the empty units, are being granted small, reasonable rent decreases during construction because there's so much of it. So the buildings are turning over and they are being improved with vacancy decontrol.
So when they get that decrease in rent, as soon as the project is complete...
Goes back to normal.
Right.
Goes back to normal. Do we still need rent control in Santa Monica?
Oh,
absolutely.
Yes. With 70% renters, 70% of our housing is our renters. The very fabric of this town, like Carolyn mentioned earlier, that people say they love about it, people who've either lived here and sent their children from John Adams to Samo High and come back and the college and beyond, and people who've just moved here are the same. They love this town. They love the nature and the people and the character of this town. that means they love the renters because we're 70% of them. And protecting the ability of someone to start a small business or send their children through the school system or age in place. I talked to a group in front of a coffee shop the other day, and one gentleman said, "Oh, I'm an owner, so you don't have to give me your pitch for your candidacy." And his friend, who was having coffee with him, said, "Yeah, but I am. Don't you care about me?"
Right,
and she
right.
kind of jabbed him as a joke, and he. It gave him a whole new, just that 5-second statement from his good friend gave him a different perspective, and he listened to some of the things we were talking about.
And
Carolyn, I saw you got excited when I asked the question.
I get this question asked all the time, and I absolutely think that we need it. And I hope that everyone understands that rent control allows people who have lived in this community for years and years, who have made it their home, to be able to stay here, quite frankly. As you've mentioned, there are so many market pressures on Santa Monica, and rent control affords people that stability. I myself am not a renter, I'm a homeowner. And the reason that my husband and I decided to move to Santa Monica is because we appreciated the diversity and the integrity of this community. I was walking up Montana and I met this woman, and she's a homeowner, and she's been a homeowner for 30 years, and she said, "We absolutely need rent control. That's why I moved here. That's why my daughters grew up here. I don't want to see us turn into this homogenous community where it's so expensive to live. We need to be able to have that diversity of opinion, of thought, of renters and homeowners, and be able to afford these people who've contributed to what we have today the ability to stay here."
Not to mention employees who can live close to where they work.
Right.
Not everyone's a multimillionaire,
Right.
tech wizard. Some people, work in the service industry or automotive industry, work in the hospitals, and they need to be able to live close to where they work too for our environmental goals and our climate change goals. To reduce traffic. And
so you're saying that 70% of the units are about at market rate.
67%, according to our annual report.
So that means that 33% are still
what you would consider
tenants.
long-term
tenants.
That's right.
And how long is long-term? I mean,
Before Costa-Hawkins, before vacancy decontrol.
And like I said, there have come to be, in the discussion about it, kind of two generations of long-term. So long-term classically has meant someone who moved in before, near the beginning of rent control through the 80s and before Costa-Hawkins vacancy decontrol. However, the market has not, some of that stability we were talking about, that helps the owners as well. There have been moments, Northridge earthquake is a prime example, where building values plummeted.
Right, because it wasn't just in Northridge.
But, that was a moment that may have been painful for some renters, but rent, the general adjustment means the rent goes up steadily every year. That helped preserve some building value for some of the owners as well. But there's a whole crop of folks that are in their places that maybe moved in the mid to late 90s who are still paying, pretty relatively reasonable prices.
So what do you see, Carolyn, start with you. What do you see as the most long-term pressing issue on the Rent Control Board?
I think that we would have to say that the issue of tenant harassment continues to be an issue. Habitability and tenant harassment.
But give me some examples of that.
So let's say that you have a building and the tenant has been in there since 1980 and they're paying $500 a month, and the landlord knows that if they were able to have this tenant vacate, they would be able to re-rent the unit at $2,000 a month and make a significant profit. What we've seen and what I've seen in my career has been landlords who will harass the tenants by not making the necessary repairs or entering the unit without proper notice, continually having an adversarial relationship with the tenant in an effort to harass them into moving so that they can then re-rent the unit at a market rate. And I think that as our economy continues to recover and the incentive to further develop and further re-rent units grows, this is only going to continue and get worse. So I think that, of course, it's not every landlord, but I've seen it firsthand. There are these issues of tenant harassment. There are issues where the building will be vacant all but 1 or 2 units, and the landlord will try to harass those tenants into leaving so that they can sell the building. Because as I'm sure you know, landlords can end up paying a high cost for relocation expenses, especially for tenants who have been long-term tenants. And for some landlords, it's easier to harass those tenants into leaving rather than to pay them those relocation expenses.
On the Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights hotline, when you train as a volunteer to work that hotline, you're expected to educate yourself fully and prove yourself that you know the law, that you know the tenets of Measure RR, that you know the tenant harassment ordinance, and they only let you volunteer for 2 weeks at a time, twice a year, because it is intense. And the most recent time I volunteered was right before I was appointed to the board, and now I'm not able to participate in that right now. But in 2 weeks, I logged 36 calls, the most recent time, and you have people in tears. You have people distraught. An elderly woman I spoke to had her adult daughter move back in with her, an adult daughter who'd been on the original lease, by the way, as a child, because they were being harassed. And it's certainly not every owner. Most of our owners come to the board asking, how can I help, how can I do better? But there are certainly some bad actors who have acted so egregiously that the tenant harassment ordinance has had to be beefed up. We also had to pass Measure RR to make sure everyone was cooperating and following the law. It's a major problem to preserving tenancies that are in place.
And I think that's why it's important that you have these champions on the rent control board who can identify these issues and be able to enforce the law fairly, but of course knowing that there is this imbalance of power, especially when you have potentially landlords with deep pockets and time to harass these tenants, and tenants who feel like, I don't know where to go. So it's really important to be able to reach out to educate, but also to make sure that we're leveling the playing field for everyone so that a few bad actors don't spoil the whole bunch.
So let's talk about vision, the vision thing. Where do you see Santa Monica? What's your vision of Santa Monica in 5 years and 10 years? Carolyn?
I think that I see Santa Monica as a place that I'm going to grow old and raise my family. And I think that we want to make sure that we're being sustainable. We want to make sure that we're being respectful and we're having civil discourse with each other. And I certainly don't want to see it turned into another Miami Beach where it's completely overdeveloped and you can't see the ocean because all you're seeing is high-rise apartments for miles. I think that that's why people move here, is because of the character of this city, and I love this city and I want to maintain that. As part of that is making sure that we're treating each other with respect and enforcing the law. I think that on the rent control board specifically, I'm very much looking forward to the results of the Ellis study. I want to make sure that we're able to maintain the supply of rent-controlled units in Santa Monica. Hopefully 5 years from now, we're going to have addressed some of those issues. We're going to make sure that we're a fair voice for landlords and for tenants. And 10 years from now, I think we're going to continue to look at affordable housing solutions, solutions for transit-oriented development. I know we've had this great addition of the Expo line. We have these great esplanades that have been added in. I'd really love to see, like Anastasia mentioned, being able to live close to where you work. I think that that's important in reducing our traffic and our daily car trips, but also in making sure that if you don't work in this city, that you're able to be near transit so that we can help our sustainable future and make this a safe and healthy place to live for the next generation.
Thank you. Anastasia?
I too, I gave birth to my son here 1.5 years ago at St. John's Hospital, and I'm in my second rent control department with my husband and my son now and my dog, and we're not going anywhere. We are happy as clams to be here, and part of serving in public service is showing yourselves and your family and your neighbors that you care, that you cared enough to get involved and to educate yourself on the issues and to jump in, head first and in our case, serve and attempt to serve on the rent control board is just really where you see the rubber meet the road. It's an opportunity to serve. And I want to see our city do even more. We have been such a beacon. We're above our quotas on a lot of categories of affordable housing, but there's still more to do. We've had a 20% reduction in homelessness just in our city, which beats the county and the averages of the other big cities by leaps and bounds, but there's still more to do. I'd love to see more affordable housing. I would love to see better infrastructure projects and more, the metro and the wonderful measures that are going to get us interconnected more with Los Angeles County. And there's always more work to do. And as long as I'm here, I plan to have enough energy to help everything I can.
Well, I thank you both. I thank you both for
Thank
stepping
you.
forward
Yes.
for the time you plan to spend, hope to spend, and have spent on the Rent Control Board. I thank you both.
Thank you, Sandy.
And on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica Education Fund and CityTV, we want to thank you for stepping forward to watching us, for sitting there and watching us. This conversation is part of our 2016 election programming and will be replayed multiple times on Santa Monica City TV, Channel 16, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on cable channel 99. For a schedule of replay times and to view the conversation online, we invite you to go to smvote.org. And for more information on the local and state candidates and the ballot measures, there are so many of those, please check out Voters Edge at votersedge.org. And thank you, our audience, for your interest. It takes all of us to make democracy work. Bye for now.